Hello, Sunderland fans. Welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by The Echo. My name's James Copley and I'm joined by my colleague Phil Smith. The big news coming out of the Northeast this morning is that Tony Mowbray has departed as Sunderland's head coach. He departed late last night and handily me and Phil were both in bed and didn't realise until this morning, which was great, wasn't it?
Well, it's been a long few days and a long few weeks on the road with Sunderland, and we've got some more long trips and long days ahead. So, yeah, not ideal, but we all need to sleep at some point. Even me, I need to sleep sometimes.
Yeah, big shout out to our boss Richard Mania for sorting all of that last night while we were blissfully unaware. So Tony Mowbray, 15 months in charge, 65 games, 28 draws, 18 losses. I could probably do with looking up his wins there. I didn't write that down. Anyway, I'll come back to that. Christ, this is going well. Win percentage of exactly 40%, 6th last season and a playoff semi-final loss. 2 wins in his last 9, 9th in the league, and 3 points off the playoffs currently. Is it harsh or not, Phil?
Well, yeah, it is. Of course it is. But I think that everybody knows that this is probably more a decision about culture than it is purely about results. I mean, the stat you mentioned about 2 wins in 9 is definitely relevant. There's a reason they've made this decision now after what was a bit of a frustrating week. But even within that, should never have got beat at Plymouth. Mowbray had no part to play in the Huddersfield build-up because he had a nasty chest infection and he was basically bedridden. And then a point away at Millwall, which I think in isolation, even if there was some concerns with the performance, I don't think anybody would say is a dismal result. So it is harsh. It's harsh by any measurement. Tony Mowbray took over a team that was expected to be at the lower end of the table in a very difficult moment after Alex Neil's sudden departure. He took them to the playoffs, albeit on a lower points total than you would normally expect, but even so, a huge overachievement. Playing some of the best football we've ever seen. He lost Ross Stewart, he lost Ahmad, he lost some of his most experienced voices in the dressing room, and he kept the results pretty much rolling. And the one thing I want to say to show that, of course, it's harsh, is that if you go on, if you look at Y-Scouts models, Sunderland have the youngest average age in the division this season, and yet they have the 3rd best expected points total. So Mowbray was doing a good job, and he was performing well against a lot of the things we know the club are looking for, and that's a fact. But at the same time, I think there's a reason why none of us were absolutely stunned when we saw the news. Because I think Mowbray was appointed really as a transition manager to handle that transition from Alex Neil leaving sooner than anyone expected. And I think the fact that Sunderland were being linked with new head coaches last April told you that really Sunderland had a different idea for the long term. And I think a lot of us have been expecting this at some stage, and we've expected the next head coach when they come in to be a sort of young, inverted commas, up and coming, very much, a trust the process coach, if you like. Given the way that the recruitment's gone and the very different dressing room we have at Sunderland now, I wouldn't be surprised at all if it was a multilingual head coach. I think that's potentially something that the club will be looking at. So I think there's 2 sides to this. One is that, yeah, it's absolutely harsh. It's undoubtedly harsh, and what an amazing job Tony Mowbray's done, and what a platform he's left for whoever comes behind him. But at the same time, I think we all know enough about how Sunderland operate now to go a little bit beyond the knee-jerk and to understand that they don't make decisions based on results in a week. It might be, the results in the week might be the reason why it's happened now, if that makes sense, but that's not why they've made the decision. It's a cultural thing, and I'm not right now getting into the good or the bad of that. Everyone will have their own opinions, but I think we all understand that this isn't a club that reacts to a couple of results, and that tells you that this is something they've been thinking about for a long time, and we kind of knew that anyway, because of the kind of persistent speculation we've had around Mowbray's position for going on 6 months now.
Yeah, absolutely. The stat I mentioned earlier that I managed to fudge at the beginning of the podcast was that Tony Mowbray's Sunderland record: played 35, won 26, drawn 18, lost 21. So win percentage rate of 40%. We'll just have a little quick look at some of the fan reaction on Twitter. Chris Sims said he felt like the writing was on the wall the past few weeks, seemed to have no plan B. But to be fair, when plan A worked, it was good. Hannah said it was the right call. Leon Flint says joke of a decision. George Clifford said he's a good man who's been hung out to dry by this season's incomings and outgoings. I'm sure we'll get on to a little bit of recruitment analysis soon, Phil. But I guess this sort of speaks to your point, the couple of fan reactions I've read there. It is very split and it is very mixed. there's an acceptance that Tony Mowbray has done a really good job at Sunderland with a really young squad, as you mentioned, but results over the past sort of 6 games haven't been quite good enough. And I think that comes against the stated aim of the sport director, Christian Speakman, in the summer when he said that Sunderland want to be in and around the playoffs and pushing for the top 2. And they've sort of dropped behind that pace a little bit with a busy schedule coming up over Christmas. And unfortunately, it's meant that Tony Mowbray has lost his job.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that specific point, because this is, again, what I'm coming back to when I say I feel this is more cultural than results driven, because we know Sunderland are a data-driven operation. They believe heavily in statistical analysis, data analysis. Now, they'll have more sophisticated models than we do, and maybe they're saying something a little bit differently. But I've just mentioned that all data suggests that Sunderland are better than the results have been. And that's what really interests me about this decision. Because if the stated aim is to progress this team, then by any statistical measure, that is happening under Tony Mowbray at Sunderland this season. They've got a better XG. They've got a significantly better XG against. They're having more touches in the opposition box, more entries into the final third. They're creating better chances. Where we seem to have got a fracture is that almost is what's responsible for the fact that Sunderland aren't getting the fruits of that labour. Mowbray's view is that we've got inexperienced strikers who aren't ready for the Championship. My suspicion is that the reason he's gone is because that's not how the club hierarchy see it. And I think that's really interesting in terms of what happens next. Because, everyone's seen the quote, I think, of Mowbray speaking after the Millwall game, essentially saying, yeah, I think we would get better results if I just went with Pritchard and Dak up front. But he doesn't feel he can do that. So that's I hope we get the chance to put that question to the club actually at some point, because I think that's really fascinating, is where they see this, because by any measurement, Sunderland were improving the season, arguably with the weakest team without Ahmad and Stewart. And so that's one of the fascinating things. But again, that just underlines to me that I'm sure people already kind of understand. And there's a lot of cultural stuff. It's about the way that Kirill and Christian want to run the club, how they want things to operate behind the scenes, quite intangible almost, I think, stuff that's hard to discuss. But yeah, it's about, I think, how they see the club operating in the next 3 to 5 years as much as it is about how they performed against Huddersfield, if that makes sense.
No, it does. You mentioned there, Phil, about the statistics, the XG against Sunderland having a young team. All these metrics that we can sort of throw together and say Sunderland are improving or have improved, or are a good side, but have just been unlucky in terms of hitting the post and the woodwork about 9 times and not having a striker who's really sort of taken the club and ran with it. But there'll be people listening to this podcast, Phil, that will say, well, yeah, it's all good that these statistics are there and are positive, but when it comes to the eye test, Sunderland have maybe fallen a little bit below par in recent weeks. And actually, I think it is worth mentioning when it comes to Mowbray, is that earlier on in the season, and I don't want to make excuses for anybody, but he has had some horrendous look in terms of refereeing decisions. I know it evens out over the course of the season, but unfortunately for him, he's not going to be here, and injuries, he's not going to be here for the season. I mean, the Dan Neil red card against Middlesbrough, the penalty that wasn't given against Leicester City, it just goes to show what football can be like. It is so ruthless and so cutthroat. You need a little bit of luck. You need to pass the eye test, and the statistics need to be good as well.
As you say, hasn't kicked a ball yet this season. Dennis Serkin's had injury problems.
Corey Evans, we could have used Corey Evans at many points in this season with his experience.
Jay Matete would have played. Pierre Ekwah ended up sidelined for about 5 weeks with a dead leg that nobody saw the severity of that coming, and there wasn't another real midfielder for Mowbray to lean on in that phase. So there were all of these things. It's interesting, and it is a lot about perception and people's opinions, and I totally get that, because I just see it differently. I just think Sunderland have been unlucky this season. They should have more points than they do. And I actually think that's a really impressive achievement when you look at the players who came in the summer and the players who left. I think Mowbray's done a fantastic job on that. What we can say is that at a certain point, something becomes a pattern, right? So at a certain point, it stops entirely being unlucky, and you go, well, there must be some reason why you keep, coming out on the wrong side of this. And again, it just comes back to whether you believe the issue with the strikers, for example, and the finishing is that Mowbray is too dependent on the wingers and he's not creating good enough chances, or whether you think that the strikers aren't ready. My personal view to me is that I think the strikers aren't ready. I don't think you can expect much better service than Clark and Roberts. And I think personally what we're seeing a lot of the time is that the opposition centre-halves are just so strong and so much more experienced that they're able to manage those moments better. in Sunderland's young strikers. Like, other people will see it differently and say that Mowbray was stubborn, they need to mix things up and find a way. And I totally respect that as well. And I guess that's what we're going to find out in the next 6 weeks, isn't it? That's football. Someone will come in and hit the same issues, and we'll look and go, well, what's happening here? Or someone will come in and find some answers, and we'll go, oh, well, fair enough. So that's going to be, I guess, how this whole thing is defined, really. And we won't know for a little while longer yet. Excuse me while I just plug in, James. You continue.
No, that's fine. Well, I suppose the point to make, Phil, and we've made it before on this podcast, in amongst sort of managerial uncertainty and sackings, is that failure is actually collective at a football club, and I think it's worth noting that a lot of people thought that Tony Mowbray had to go because Sunderland weren't scoring goals through the strikers, but the players have to take a little bit of responsibility for that. Christian Speakman, Stuart Harvey, the recruitment team have identified these players and they've not quite been ready. So it's on everybody really as a club, in my opinion, players, manager, and the board. I think, it's almost harsh to scapegoat one person, but I think what we've been able to tell is that there has been, I don't want to say rift or disagreement because maybe that's too strong a word, but there's been some sort of, disagreement. I don't think that's any secret. Mowbray's come out and said it really. Difference of opinions, probably the best phrase. And I think that all goes back to the summer, to the Luton game in the playoff semi-final. What Mowbray said after that, the uncertainty in the summer surrounding his job. I just can't help feel that all of this is sort of, become part of a wider picture. And as you mentioned, the cultural factors there.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the one thing I would say as well is that in a way, I'm sort of pleased that there's been a decisiveness about this and that it hasn't been allowed to get too openly acrimonious. And I think, listen, it's really difficult for Tony Mowbray when you're in a press conference, when you've just drawn a game and you've got me sat there trying to work out why you've gone winless in a week, and I'm frustrated and the fans are frustrated, and you're saying, why don't you just pick Pritchard? Why don't you just pick Dak? Because then that puts him in a difficult situation. But I think what he said, I think, he was probably edging towards kind of open rebellion, and saying, I don't think these strikers are ready, but I have to play them because that's the club philosophy. And, and that's another thing where it's really interesting, isn't it? Because Mowbray does pick young players. I mean, he does it repeatedly. Joe Bellingham, that was the first time he hadn't started a game on Saturday. It's great. And that's what leans me towards kind of agreeing with Mowbray on the striker issue, because he's not someone who uses youth and inexperience as an excuse generally. We've all seen managers who say that they want to play young players, but we know they don't mean it because they never put it into action. Mowbray does. But I think at that point, he was edging towards a kind of open rebellion. And I do think the speed of how it's happened shows you that both parties have kind of expected this for quite a while. And it's almost as if as soon as there's been that little bit of fracture, as soon as the results have dipped, as soon as everyone's stopped being able to kind of toe the line, it's almost been like, right, okay, we kind of known this is coming, so let's do it. And it is, I think, though, it's a really sad day, I think, because, when people think back to Tony Mowbray, he'll be synonymous with free-flowing, attacking football, with a team that was vibrant, was totally fearless, that people loved watching. And more importantly than that, the way he conducted himself off the pitch from start to finish was just total class. And I think he set the standard really for Sunderland head coach in terms of the way he connected with supporters, the football he played. I really do think he set the standard, and we should always be looking for that now from a head coach. We should always be saying, well, Tony managed it, so why can't anybody else? The humility he showed, the sense of humour, the quality of football, not make the results. Let's not get round it. With Sunderland's budget, the results were really good. With where Sunderland were right now in the Championship, the results were really good. And so I have mixed emotions, because I am pleased that the decision was made, given that I think minds were already made up. And I'm pleased that they haven't just let it drag out and get really bitter and openly acrimonious. And I also understand that part of the reason why Mowbray's had success is because he had a group of talented young players. Ahmad, an outstanding signing. Nobody wanted Ahmad after his loan at Rangers. People didn't know what he was about. People didn't think he was good enough. It hadn't worked out. Why wasn't he playing at Rangers? Any Championship club could have gone for Ahmad. Unbelievable recruitment. And there's lots of examples like that. He
didn't really play for us until December.
Exactly, right? So that was brilliant recruitment, and Mowbray benefited from that. So I have mixed emotions, because I think you have to accept that although it's been bumpy at times, generally speaking, the change in strategy and the extra stability and everything that's changed behind the scenes has been a huge part in leading Sunderland to a point where we can now realistically think of them as a potential Premier League club in the next 5 years. And so I think there has to be an element of respect and trust when they make a decision like this, that there's a reason for it. But I also do think that it's, when someone of Tony's class and stature leaves, it's a sad day, and it's right that we mark, the legacy he leaves and the standards that he set.
You touched upon it there, Phil, but Tony Mowbray, as a man, in your experience with him, obviously you've been doing this job for a little while now. I think your first manager was David Moyes, so you've been around the block a bit. Obviously, Grayson Coleman, Jack Ross, Parkinson, Lee Johnson, Alex Neil, and then Mowbray with a couple of caretakers in there for good measure. How's he been to deal with, on a human level and on a professional level as well?
Yeah, one of the best people I've ever had the pleasure of coming across in football, by a long distance. I've been really fortunate really with some of the managers. Jack Ross was a real professional, really good to deal with in a difficult situation. Chris Coleman was outstanding to deal with in a difficult situation, albeit on the pitch it didn't work at all, did it? But I think Tony was very respectful. He was very funny, which is not something, I'd be the first to say is not something I really anticipated when he came in. I think Sunderland definitely got the best of Mowbray because he'd had a long time in Blackburn where I think things had gone a little bit still and arguably a little bit sour. I think he missed his family. I think he missed his home. He missed the Northeast. He'd been living away. And I think coming back to Sunderland allowed him, I think it just totally reinvigorated with him. He had these brilliant working conditions. He could drive to work. He could go home and see his family. He was working with Clark, with Roberts, with Ahmad. I think it just totally gave him his love for coaching and his love for management back. And we all benefited from that because we got such a lively personality. It's been by a long distance, the best 15 months I've had in this job, by a long distance. But also, as I kind of said before, but part of that is because the structure behind him is right. That you have to acknowledge that as well. It's not just Mowbray. The reason why it's been such a good period is because Mowbray came into, although it was very difficult in some ways with Alex Neil's departure, it was also quite a good environment in a lot of other ways because of the recruitment changes, because of the general stability that the club had found, sort of a boardroom level. So we have to acknowledge that as well. But there's no doubt that Mowbray is kind of one of the reasons why this has been such a fun time. To be following Sunderland, whether you're a supporter or a journalist or a player or whatever. And there is something, I think, like I said, there is a small part of me that thinks, well, if the decision was basically made, which I suspect it has been for a while, then I'm glad that we get to preserve, what a special time this has been, rather than it be soured by a kind of, a long and acrimonious ending.
No, absolutely. And I think it's probably worth talking about the players and their reaction and their relationship with Mowbray. Phil, I've spoken to sort of a couple of people on the periphery in and around Sunderland, and the general feeling I get is that they were shocked, disappointed. They all really liked Mowbray, especially the British players. Obviously, his relationship with Patrick Roberts is quite clear. He's got great things out of Jack Clark. We saw Luke O'Nine's interview where he wanted to say that the unbeaten run started now, and they wanted to really do it for Mowbray. And yeah, it's a shame for them as well, I guess, because I think Mowbray had cultivated a real strong team spirit off the field. Obviously, that hadn't translated into results in the last 6 games or so, but I do feel like this group is a good group and that they are together. And he does leave sort of an attractive proposition in a way because they are well coached and they are a talented group.
Yeah, I think it'll be a really attractive job for head coaches. Really, really, really attractive. There are some challenges. You're going up against teams at the moment with significantly bigger budgets and more experienced squads. But I think for any ambitious young head coach, the platform that Mowbray leaves is an amazing one. Pretty united dressing room, I think, albeit one that's changed a lot from Sunderland's promotion from League One. And I go back to that point about maybe someone who can, whether it be because they're multilingual or whatever, maybe someone who can sort of speak to all corners of all sort of sides of the dressing room might be something that's looked at, I think. But I think it's a really good group that anyone would be fairly lucky to pick up at this stage, I think. And obviously the interesting question moving forward is January and the summer going to be doubling down on this approach? Is there going to be a little bit of a tweak to try and give the new head coach a bit more experience? I strongly suspect it will be the former, because absolutely everything they've done so far and continue to do suggests that they will double or triple down if they can. But that's obviously going to be a really interesting thing to watch going forward. But I think it's a good time. Normally managers say you get a job because everything's wrong at a club. And for all the reasons that we've been outlining over the last 20 minutes, that is not the case at Sunderland. You are actually picking up a club and a team where there was very, very little wrong with it. There's one or two significant things wrong with it, and that's a big hurdle to overcome. But generally speaking, you're picking up a club in a fantastic place.
Yeah. Shall we have some fun and have a little look at the names and do some speculation, Phil?
Oh, marvellous. That's exactly what I want to do right now.
Right, so I had some odds sent through to my inbox about 2 hours ago. They've probably shifted a little bit. I won't go through the actual odds, but the first 5 names I was sent were John Eustace, Nathan Jones, Neil Warnock, Paul Heckingbottom, and Steve Bruce. Discuss. The floor is yours.
Well, I'm going to humbly suggest that it's more likely to be me and you as a managerial duo than Nathan Jones, Neil Warnock, or Steve Bruce. Listen, I mean, sometimes you just have to. It's not even stuff that's between the lines. Sometimes just read the lines. You look at Kirill Louis-Dreyfus's statement where he talks about strong playing identity and also the environment of high performance. Now, a lot of those managers you've mentioned, I have utmost respect for because they've had exceptional careers and delivered exceptional results. But I don't see any alignment between Nathan Jones in terms of playing style and where I think Sunderland want to go to. And yeah, Steve Bruce is just not going to happen. Warnock is someone who I have an absolutely insane amount of respect for. It's just not going to be someone of that profile. Although
he will probably throw his hat into the ring for the job at some point.
Listen, I would love it in a lot of ways. I've so much time for that man, and it would be brilliant. But it's just not going to happen. I suppose John Eustace and Paul Heckingbottom are much, inverted commas, better shouts in terms of I think they would fit the structure a lot better and have a lot more experience working within a structure like that. My gut tells me it'll be someone not on that list. My gut tells me that it's probably going to be someone that we don't know a huge amount about. But to be fair, that's that gut instinct rather than inside information at this stage.
Yeah, one of the bigger names on the list of bookies odds, and just in the mouths of fans as well. Probably unlikely, really, but ex-Brighton and Chelsea manager Graham Potter. I imagine he's probably
unlikely.
Yeah, I imagine he's
probably unlikely. Is that what you're saying?
He's probably got bigger fish to fry at some point, given the job he's just left. And the job he did at Brighton was absolutely tremendous, really. I mean, Sunderland's setup and structure is good and its positives, and the recruitment, is very modern, but I think that's a step too far in it, really, Graham Potter.
Yeah, it's in that mould, but it's not going to be Graham Potter. It's not going to be Graham Potter, I don't think. Well, maybe it will, and everyone can laugh at me, and won't be much different to any normal day, so that's absolutely fine. But I strongly suspect it's not going to be Graham Potter, but it will be something in that mould. And I know a lot gets made of the model, and I understand why, and we question it, and we get frustrated with it, and I get all of that. The reality is, it's not really Sunderland's model; it's the new model in football. And one of the reasons why Alex Neil went to Stoke was because that was one of the very, very, very last clubs, even in the EFL, never mind just the Premier League and the top leagues of Europe, where you can still go in and have total control as a manager. It doesn't exist anymore. Just doesn't. It just doesn't. It's not all. This isn't like Sunderland have their own way of doing things, and maybe it is a bit more extreme than some other clubs. But it's not a Sunderland thing. It's football. So if any head coach now wants to get in the game and be a head coach, they do so knowing that they're not going to have the final say on recruitment. That they're going to have to play young players. It's just the new era of football. Unless you're a top 6 club and you can afford to spend who you want, and you don't have to worry too much about development and all that kind of thing. So while we'll continue to discuss it, and rightly so, because we should always be scrutinised, I think it's important to say that I don't see that being an issue for Sunderland recruiting a new head coach, because I think realistically that's what basically every aspiring head coach knows they're walking into now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And well, I'm asking you this question, but I suppose I already know the answer, really. But the way Sunderland operate, Phil, they usually have an eye on the future, don't they? They're going to have been profiling various different head coaches. The process is probably underway and has been underway for months now. That's not to say that Tony Mowbray's card was marked, but that's just the way sort of modern football clubs do it within that model that we've just spoken about.
Yeah, and even in that very difficult period with the Francesco Farioli links and stuff, and it was clear that caused some issues behind the scenes. Even Mowbray said, look, one thing I would say is that the reason I got this job within 2 or 3 days of Alex Neil leaving was because they'd obviously done their background research before Alex left, and I'd been identified as someone who, had a record of stabilising the teams in the Championship, a record of developing young players. So he kind of understood that he benefited from that process, and now he was probably coming out on the other side of it. And I think he understood that. So yeah, it's quite difficult to say because I don't know what stage Sunderland are at, as in, have they already got a preferred candidate, in which case it would potentially move quite quickly, or do they have a handful of potential candidates and they're going to move into an interview process, which would potentially be a week or so. I think the timing of it is interesting because you've got 3 pretty huge games coming up and 3 very difficult games coming up. Now, are Sunderland kind of looking at that going, well, this is going to be a very difficult period, which sort of ironically gives us a chance to have a breath and try and find a new head coach? Or are they looking at it going, we've got 3 difficult games coming up, we think we know who we want and we want them through the door right now to manage these games? So yeah, that's going to be interesting. I suspect we'll know either way fairly soon.
I was going to say, I bet Mike Dodds isn't thanking you for the 3 games that is coming up. Obviously, he's an interim charge for the moment. Yeah. Whether he manages one of those games, we don't know. But yeah, it's a tough assignment really for him. Obviously, I think he lost both of his games when he had the role briefly in League One before Alex Neil came in. I want to move it back to last summer, Phil. We talked a little bit about the differences and young players versus experienced players and whatnot. Sunderland decided to let Lyndon Gooch, Danny Barth go. Obviously, Stoke City, where Lyndon Gooch has gone, they aren't doing too well at the moment. And Norwich have been sort of so. I'm not saying both players would have drastically improved Sunderland's fortunes over these games, but there's a serious argument to suggest that they could have contributed off the pitch and on the pitch, and that a lot of the time, well, most of the time, actually, Tony Mowbray has been warning against losing too much experience. And It's also probably worth noting as well that had an offer come in, Pritchard probably would have been allowed to leave in the summer as well. This recruitment team has brought some brilliant players in. We've listed them earlier. We don't need to go through them again. But you can turn the parameters and the dials a little bit too far sometimes and sort of run before you can walk. Do you think that's happening? Do you think Sunderland need to be careful? Yeah. Is it something that the new coach is going to have to obviously try and take into account?
Yeah, I suppose it's interesting because I think because I instinctively agree with you to an extent, particularly Pritchard, I think would have been a big miss if he'd gone.
Oh, massive.
But are we not at risk of being hypocritical because we've sat and talked about how generally the team's improved, their control of games is better, pretty much everything about it is better up until the final third. So are we not being hypocritical by then saying that what they've done in recruitment is potentially wrong? I'm asking that as a genuine question because my instinct is, well, actually, they've managed this transition and the performances have not got worse at all. And I know some people will be listening and saying, well, it's about the results, and I totally accept that. So then probably a better question is it less about experience and is it just more about the caliber in both boxes at the moment? That's my instinct. And I suppose you could say that the two go hand in hand, because if you had more experience, particularly in the final third, where I think the 4 strikers at the moment look very raw, then potentially that domination of games would be producing the results that it deserves. So I agree with you to a certain point, but I think it's quite difficult when those positions that you mentioned aren't really the positions where there's issues at the moment. I get the Danny Bart one to an extent because he had an excellent season, but let's not pretend that Sunderland weren't shipping chances or conceding goals from set pieces last season, because they were. And he was exceptional. I'm not rewriting history at all. He was brilliant. He held a team together that at times, was ridiculous in terms of the injuries. But yeah, I find it quite hard to know where I stand on that one, because if my belief, which it is that Sunderland have grown as a team this year all round, and that the issue really is that the stardust they've lost in Ahmad, then it would be hypocritical to say that they're letting the experience go has been a massive mistake. Maybe we'll more know that in a couple of weeks, because now is when you really need those figures in the dressing room. When you're going through a difficult period, a period of change, you've got tough games coming up. Maybe that's something we'll be talking about in 2 weeks. Saying, this has been a really challenging period, and that's when someone really needed that experience in the dressing room. My personal gut feeling is I'm not sure how big an issue it has been up until this point. It might actually be now that you really need those Lyndon Gooches and those Danny Barts to say, look, difficult spell, but to keep things together. So, yeah, it's a really interesting question, one that I don't have the answer to yet, would be my honest response to it.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And the small matter remains to discuss that Sunderland are playing Newcastle United for the first time since 2016.
I totally forgotten about that.
In the FA Cup in January, obviously that was when it was a draw Sunday. Sunday feels like a long time ago now, doesn't it? Bloody hell! But yeah, that's happening.
Is that what anybody needs? Anybody? Is that what any of us need?
Not at the moment.
I'm not convinced.
Not at the moment.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, your initial reaction to that. Mine was I was at work, obviously, and my reaction was just to sort of scream at the television. And my partner Louise was just sort of, "What's wrong?" And I was just like, "Jesus!" But yeah, interesting game.
Initially, my reaction was just like, "Oh, there's nothing good can come of that." just no.
I mean, the atmosphere in the build-up will almost
probably
be brilliant.
Yeah, I think I've softened slightly in that, like you say, it will be a special occasion. It really will be. That they are unique. There's a reason why we're all addicted to them, even though we kind of hate them at the same time. It will be an amazing occasion, and I think that from a Sunderland perspective, realistically, I think expectations are going to be pretty measured going into that game. Your concern is that if it becomes a bad defeat, it doesn't really matter what the relative status of the two teams are. A bad defeat in the derby is a bad defeat in the derby.
Yeah.
So that's your only kind of fear. But I think, and that's why you can't say it's a free hit. There's no such thing in the derby. Like, there just isn't. But there is obviously a context to it that I'm sure that every Sunderland fan will be aware of, and will sort of measure the performance against accordingly. Listen, let's be positive and say what an opportunity for some of these players to become an absolute hero for the rest of time for the club, and that's certainly how they have to view it. Yeah, I would rather have just got Mansfield away, but it wasn't to be. So let's see.
Think of the page views and the interest and the reader minutes, Phil.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it's now Tuesday. Next game is on Saturday. Phil, what is your gut feeling? Do you think Sunderland will or could have the new man in by then, or at least in the stands, or will it sort of trickle on for a little bit longer than that? Maybe you've obviously stated on this podcast that you do think it'll be relatively quick, but that's the question, I suppose, at the moment. Will it be in time for Saturday?
Yeah, my gut tells me that I think it probably will be, but at the same time, Saturday feels really. What day is it? Is it Tuesday today? Yeah,
it's only Tuesday. It feels like
it's Tuesday, right? Okay, Saturday feels pretty close to me by any measurement. I think that feels a little close for someone to be in charge, but I don't envisage this being a long process. I think, given that. Having said that, I think it's something that's probably been on the cards for a little while, albeit something that's accelerated a hell of a lot over the week. I'd be really surprised if Sunderland, even if they haven't got someone inverted commas lined up, ready to go, I'd be really surprised if they didn't have a fairly strong idea of what they want to do next. So I don't think this is going to be a lengthy process. But having said that, for someone to be in the dugout on Saturday feels a very, very tight time frame.
Yeah, it does. And very quickly, Phil, we better talk about some sort of team news and the state of Sunderland's squad, really. Obviously, we won't be talking to Tony Mowbray midweek, but what's the latest that we've got at the moment, just in terms of injuries, returnees, who might drop out, who might come in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't envisage a huge amount of change. Roosin, I think, will probably be fit, but will he play? We don't know. Sealt will be fit, but will he play? I highly doubt it. Chris Rigg will be fit, so he might be on the bench, but again, I doubt he'll play. Elise is probably only a couple of weeks away, but won't be ready. Sirkin, I'd be stunned if he was ready because he wasn't training by the end of last week. So I think it's going to be pretty much as you were, and the biggest decision for whoever's in charge is obviously going to be whether who they play up front, and that's going to be very interesting after Mowbray's press conference that we discussed at length earlier. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be any major changes. I do think there's sort of light at the end of the tunnel for Elise. I don't think he's too far off at all, but it's not going to be this Saturday. So yeah, I think whoever comes in, I think it's pretty much going to be a case of working with what they've got.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we'll round it up there for the moment. Thank you for joining us. You will be able to follow all of the latest managerial updates over at the Sunderland Echo website. Follow us on social media as well to keep abreast of all of the latest information. And yeah, cheers for tuning in to the Raw podcast.